Thank you, everybody. This is the Microsoft Data Platform Continuity Virtual Group. With me today is Chris Lumnah and Sean McElhaney. This is the August 2022 installment. We're going to be talking about database threats, preventing the worst with zero trust data management. So for that, I will turn this over to you guys.
All right, thanks a lot. Again, Sean McElhaney. Appreciate you guys attending. Quick bio for me, been a DBA for about 25 years prior to coming to Rubrik. Been with Rubrik for the past 2 years as a database solutions architect. So hopefully we'll be able to talk through some ideas here and give you something you can move forward with and implement in your workplace. I'll turn it over to Chris and do a quick intro.
Thank you. I'm Chris Lumnah. I have been with Rubrik now for about 4.5 years. And before that, I've spent the previous 15 years as a production DBA focused entirely on SQL Server.
All right. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. Really, we want to try to get a handle on, what companies need to focus on, as far as exploits go. Fact of the matter is this, as a company, you need to try to prevent every exploit that's out there, but really an attacker only needs to be successful on a single exploit. So, you need to think about that. You need to think about, policies, procedures, processes, and things that need to be assessed to try to minimize that impact. And then once you've identified those solutions, what do you really need to focus on? Now, the past 2 years have shown everyone how critical data is to business activities and how susceptible it is to attack. Security researchers have said for years that there's typically 2 types of organizations: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. The fact of the matter is defense in depth doesn't stop everything. And technical solutions really only go so far. They're really dependent on human interaction for data input, analysis, and maintenance. The fact of the matter is humans make mistakes, unless they're DBAs, because we're perfect. So the question becomes, how do we really fix this fundamental issue? Well, we know attacks have a common theme. They really want to impact your data in some fashion, whether that be exfiltration, ransom, denial of service, etc. If we want to minimize the risk, we really need to move beyond basic defense in depth and move towards security at the point of data. Some of the best ways to address this are implementing a zero trust framework throughout your data lifecycle, and then implementing mitigation plans to help resolve some of that. So we're going to talk more about this with a focus on 3 primary areas of mitigation: proactive mitigation, then like insurance or CYA mitigation, and then reactive mitigation. Now, let's start with proactive mitigation. Proactive mitigation focuses our efforts on tests that can be done to prevent attack from being successful. This is not a simple activity when it comes to database threats, as it spans multiple areas: your infrastructure, authentication, authorization, data lifecycle, application design and usage. These are all huge things that we really need to work around. So, Chris, can you explain what companies should be focusing on to maximize their data security?
Sure, pretty much everything. But let's start with a list of things to go with. Let's start off with infrastructure. The whole idea behind this, the things you need to focus on, is that it's not necessarily just meant for the DBA to focus on, but it's things for the DBA to think about and then work with the other teams in their organization to help mitigate. So if we think about infrastructure, how often do you think about your BIOS firmware? It's often forgotten about. And if you don't think about that and you don't patch the BIOS firmware of your hardware, then there's going to be some low-level exploits that can be exploited there, and people can do bad things to your data. you have your OS platform, which is constantly needing updates. You should be making sure that you're applying those security updates whenever they come out or as frequently as you can. And it's all done because there are tons of exploits that are in the wild that can cause harm to your data. And when you have vendors like Microsoft and others out there that are doing these red team, blue team type of tests, that's all done so they can find holes inside of their own code, exploit them, defend them, and then put out patches to you so you can get the benefit of that work and prevent your data from being touched. The hypervisor is another layer of additional entry points, and this needs to be constantly patched. I mean, recently there was I think in the last year, VMware had a couple of CVEs that were released, and they did their best to patch them as quickly as possible, because if they didn't, it would have caused a lot of people to have their data touched by people that weren't supposed to touch their data. On top of all of those layers, DBAs are generally focused on just the database platform, making sure that their SQL servers are patched to the most recent patch update if they can. If they're able to do those monthly updates, great. A lot of times that's not always the case because of other reasons, but it's things that they need to think about and try to get those patches in as soon as possible. And it's not just SQL Server. Other database platforms that are out there as well have a similar type of problem that have to be addressed. And that's all done by taking those patches you get from the vendor and getting them applied to that database platform.
Okay, so you're talking about a massive amount of patching. How should a limited set of resources really be prioritizing their patching efforts?
It's going to be working with the respective teams. DBAs can't do this all on their own. They're going to have to work with their server teams to look at the hardware. And obviously, they're going to have to look at those exploits patches that come out and decide what's the most critical that has to be done. And the ones that are the most critical needs to get applied as soon as possible. The ones that are less critical doesn't mean not important, just means they're not the ones that are being flagged in the wild as being like, these are super, super important, versus the ones that are just important, or so they still need to be applied, but just maybe not, on 2 hours after patch Tuesday. Maybe they can wait till the weekend or wait till a slightly slower time. And working with their VMware admins to have them be aware of the exploits that are available and making sure that they're patching when they're supposed to be. It's not a one team or one person does all of this type of work. It's the entire organization working as one to handle all this.
All right. Now, knowing what to patch and when to patch is great, but really, what can we do to make sure that the correct person is performing all of these activities?
Well, that's going to start with our next slide with regards to authentication, because everything's going to start here about who should have access to things inside your organization. And you have to prove you are who you are based on various different things. Obviously, turning on multi-factor authentication is a big requirement. That just should be the standard across the board from this point going forward. There should be no reason why MFA is not turned on or not used for an application if it's available. And multi-factor authentication just means having a couple of things that prove that you are who you say you are. So it's going to be something that you know, which is going to be your password, and something that you have, your phones, those little TOTP codes that everyone gets to their phones, that's right here. And then also the something you are is things like your biometrics, so Face ID, fingerprint scanning. Those are all going to be useful to prove on a multiple layer that you are who you say you are. And then After that, be smart. Don't store your passwords in clear text. Don't store them in sticky notes on your monitor, like they used to get done, and you'll see other people in your organization do. That's not a good practice at all. If you do have to store passwords, make sure that they're hashed and salted to make sure that they're protected, and if they do get leaked in any way, you can't figure out what the password is going to be. And then start looking at your password policies. Length is better than complexity. And the reason for that is that users are typically lazy. They don't want to have to remember a complex password that they have to change every 30, 60, 90 days. Because what they're going to do is just type in password 123 exclamation point. And then the next time they change it, it's password 123 @. And they just keep doing that. And that's very, very simple to breach when the bad guys know what the pattern is. They can start to use their cracking software to get in and breach those passwords very, very easily. However, a long password that is actually harder to break than just a complex password. Takes longer to do that work. So think about doing that. And I know it sounds weird, but based on NIST and other organizations that are out there, consider not doing so many password reset or periodic resets, because that just causes the users to reuse old passwords with slight deviations to them that just end up fitting the patterns that are out there. If you're going to use tokens and certificates, rotate them, treat them like a password, make sure they're time bound. So if it's a certificate, it's only valid for a certain amount of time and it's not just used forever. If it's an API token, treat it like a password and don't just store it in plain text in your scripts or in files someplace where anyone can just grab those API tokens, because most likely those API tokens are going to give you full admin access to an environment, which is another thing we're going to get to shortly. Expire the tokens on a periodic basis so you can rotate them. So this way, if someone grabs a token, it can't be used later on because it's been expired and been rotated just like a certificate is. And by all means, never put in any information onto a site that's not using HTTPS. Always make sure you're sending stuff that's going over an encrypted channel.
All right. So assuming that we follow the standards that you've referenced here, once we authenticate, we should be able to do pretty much whatever we want, right?
No, never. That goes into the next thing about privileges. And we should always be running with the least privilege required to do whatever the task at hand is. Not everyone doesn't need sysadmin access, and then developers don't need sysadmin access either, especially to production. Now, there's cases where the least privilege required is sysadmin, in which case, okay, then you have to grant that level of access, but it should be controlled and it should be documented as to why a certain account has that level of access and understood. And if there's guardrails you can put around that account so it can't do something it shouldn't be able to do, start to think about that and put that in place. Ask the question, how many people really are required to have elevated access to a database? Does everybody in that database need DB owner access? Probably not. Do they need DDL admin access or security admin access? Probably not. They probably need read-write permissions to the database and maybe execute of stored procedures to do the things that they need to do, which then starts to go into other things like who should have local administrator access to the Windows box or root level access to your Linux boxes. That should be controlled and minimized to the smallest group possible and the smallest group of trusted individuals as possible to be able to do that type of work on that box. Now, that's for the people who currently have the access and that need the access. But then you have the abuse of privileges, and that's going to be the rogue admin, the disgruntled employee that you don't think is going to do anything bad, but they just went in there and said, I'm mad at my boss today, and I'm going to go in there and cause some damage, and I'm going to delete stuff. Or maybe they're not disgruntled. Maybe they go into a database and they change a little value inside of a table, and that gives them extra vacation days or a little bit extra money in their paychecks or whatever. Think about the old access. And what I mean by that is you have a person who had elevated permissions because their role required it, but then they went on to another role. So the job that they're doing now isn't the same job, so it doesn't require the same level of access. They've just now been given brand new access to do the job that they're doing now. Has their old access been pulled? It probably should. They shouldn't have that old level of access anymore if they're not doing that job anymore. And that's something that often gets forgotten as people transition. And it gets forgotten a lot of times, not necessarily by the DBAs, but no one told the DBAs to go pull that person out or change or tell the server admins to go pull them out of this group and put them into the new groups. They only did the second half and put them into the new groups to give them access. They didn't remove them from the old groups. When if you have people that leave the company, how often does that account still remain active in your environment, whether it be an Active Directory, or maybe it's a SQL Server account that doesn't get changed when someone leaves the company? Well, they know that user ID and password. If they can get into the network, then they can utilize that password to do things to the data. Should that account be rotated and changed when that person leaves? Probably.
All right, it really sounds like you're creating a lot more work for me as a DBA. My job is to really keep the database online and processing as quickly as possible. Isn't security somebody else's job?
No, the first job of a DBA is actually data protection. You're doing two things. You're making sure your backups are done. That's one of the things that you're doing for data protection. And the other thing is to make sure that the right people have access to the data when they need it. That's part of what you're doing now by keeping the lights on. It's just not focused in that way. In this case, we're shining the light on that and saying this is an important piece of the job. You are one of the gatekeepers that prevents bad actors from doing bad things to your data, simply by making sure or asking questions to say, hey, should this person have this level of access? Should you be doing this type of application pattern to make sure that it's doing something bad that it shouldn't be doing? Maybe doing direct calls to the database versus store procedure calls instead. So something else that we need to think about is some basic questions. How many copies of your data are out there? And really think about that. You have production, you have a copy of non-production, and how many non-production environments do you have of that production database? Probably 3, because you probably have a production, a UAT, a dev, and a QA instance, and at least 2 of them are probably going to be as close to production as absolutely possible, because that's what the business has told you that they need. Okay, so you have those 4 copies, but how many backup copies do you have? Probably have the backup that was taken last night. You probably have versions of the backups taken over the last week. You probably have copies of those backups replicated to another site because you want to make sure that in case of a disaster, you can recover those backups from someplace else. Okay, those are all copies of that data that you should have your hand on the pulse for. Like, who has access to those file shares? Who has access to those databases? And who's got access to all of that data inside your database? How many times do you do a database change, and right before the change, instead of taking a backup of a database, you just copy the table? So now you have the same table sitting in your database 10 different times, and it just got a little date next to it because that was the date you made the change. It's a quick, easy rollback because now you know that if something was to go wrong with the change, you can roll back just the table. But did you go back through and clean them up? Or do you have the same table sitting out there multiple times? And guess what? Everyone has that. Everyone who's got access to the first table has access to the subsequent tables if you don't clean that up. The number one database used in the world is Excel. Everyone's got Excel on their desk. They're all downloading data. They're all putting data into their Excel workbooks, and they're crunching that data, and they're doing stuff with it for reports, and they're making business decisions off it. Does everyone that has those data, or everyone that has that data, are they supposed to have it? And understanding where all that lives, because I'll tell you right now, with sales and marketing, they all have copies of data sitting in spreadsheets all the time. And that's how they're running their business. It's how they're doing things. Who's got access to your database files? And I mean the physical MDF, NDF, and LDF files. Who's got access to the backup files? Remember, you're taking backups on a daily basis. You're probably replicating them to some other site. Who's got access to those shares? Are you pushing that data to some other third site for archive purposes? Who's got access to that data? Understanding that is important. Who's got access to delete the data? That should be very, very minimal. And that should be through a controlled process. You should not, no one should have the ability to open up Management Studio and type in delete from table. That shouldn't happen. That should all be locked down through application code, either through the application itself or through store procedures, so you can control what is actually deleted. And those store procedures should be locked down to the people who actually need to delete data. Something that DBAs don't necessarily always have control over: who's got the physical access to storage? Who can walk into your data center, walk into your SAN, and pull out a disk and walk away with it? Now, a lot of times SANs nowadays are encrypted at rest, so walking away with that's probably not going to do them too much good. But if that's not being done, can they see any of your data? Where are you placing the internal used data versus the externally used data? Do you have SQL servers that are sitting in a DMZ? What data is sitting in that DMZ? Should that data be sitting in there, or should it be as minimal amount of data as possible in that DMZ, and other data is sitting behind a firewall?
So, Chris, is it accurate to state now that really DBAs are ultimately responsible for maintaining the 3 pillars of security, namely confidentiality, integrity, and availability, across the entire data lifecycle?
Yeah, it's part of our job is data protection as our first responsibility.
Okay. So what about things like the access points that we have no control over, like applications that generate and manipulate the data that we're protecting?
Well, that's where we have to start being the trusted advisor to our developers. We have to work with them on implementing row level security and masking, and asking questions about, should this piece of data be in clear text? Should we be doing something to hide that data? Should we be looking at using always encrypted, so the data in flight is encrypted as well as the data at rest? How are you handling things like SQL injection? Should you be just doing store procedure calls or application calls versus just doing an insert statement, or just opening yourself up to any SQL call? Direct queries to the database should be extremely minimal from the application side. That should all just be done through store procedures or application calls if you can. And what level of permissions are required for a lot of those operations? Can you restrict things down to just the store procedure that does the operation, and maybe that store procedure has some elevated permissions, or that one process has some elevated permissions, but the overall process doesn't have that level of access? Think kind of instilling some of those best practices into your development teams helps you as the DBA have a stronger environment going forward. Because if you're in there at the beginning, then later on when you're supporting it 2 years from now, you've already instilled some of those best practices, and a lot of those problems are not there in the application going forward. And I'm going to say something that's going to be a little bit controversial to a DBA. Work with your auditors. As a DBA, I hated my auditors because all they did was cause me pain. They just wanted to tell me the things that I was doing wrong without any insight into why I was doing the thing that I was doing that they flagged as wrong. They're just there to do a job the same as you are. They're bringing up something that they found that goes against a best practice that you know is not in the best interest of the although you know is not the best practice, but you have understanding as to why it was done that way. Either because there's a requirement, in which case you need to take steps to mitigate the risks, or you need to work with the developers to get rid of that finding and fix it so it doesn't become a bigger issue. But in the cases like that, where you have an audit finding, use the auditors to your advantage. Because guess what? DBAs, developers, everybody down the line, we all have to do what the auditor tells us. Otherwise, there's financial risk and financial penalties that happen to the company that the auditors will impose. So if you can use the auditors to your advantage and use them as the hammer to tell the developer to fix something, even though you've been telling them 100 times to fix something, it's got more weight sometimes coming from them as just you as the DBA who's just there being grumpy. It helps you get your case solved, especially if you have to tell management, because management will then listen to the auditors and push that back down onto their development teams.
Okay, so are we talking about like internal audit and advisory teams here?
So I come from a financial background, and I was constantly under audit as a DBA. I was always audited by internal teams, and because working in a financial environment, you also had to deal with external audits from like the Price Waterhouse Coopers and Ernst and Young's. They would come in and they would do their audits. It's the same audit, just coming from two different places. If you can work with the internal teams first, by the time the external teams come in, a lot of times the findings have already been fixed. So think about it. You know there's a problem. If your boss finds the problem, it's a bigger deal. So if you're working with your internal teams and you can fix it and get it resolved and working that way, then when the external auditors come in and they find it or they don't find it, that's great. But if they find it, now they're going to start talking to your boss and other bosses in the management tree who are going to tell you, you need to fix this. And that's a bigger deal than if you just fixed it early.
All right. Now, we all know audits really tend to be stressful situations. So I want to confirm here, should I be working with these teams only during an audit activity, or should we be expanding the scope?
When I was doing DBA work, it felt like I was constantly working with the auditors because we were always working with one team or another to get this work done. And that's in a big finance shop. When you're a smaller team or a smaller shop, you probably don't have auditors coming down to your desk once a month, once a quarter. You're probably having coming down to your desk once a year. Don't wait. If you cannot wait, do as much as you can proactively, which is the whole point of this particular section here, is being proactive. Finding those things and staying ahead of them will definitely help you prevent bigger issues from happening down the road. And so, yeah, working with your teams, if you can, would be much more beneficial to you.
All right. So now let's start looking at the next mitigation tactic here, which is, we know it needs to be done to limit our attack surface area. So let's start talking about the steps we can take to ensure our downtime is limited in the event of a successful attack. So, when we think about an insurance policy, really in its most basic form, it's designed to protect us from certain risks. Proactive mitigation really is equivalent to an insurance inspector reviewing your property and telling you what you need to fix to maintain your coverage. But the fact of the matter is that someone inevitably will get hurt on your property. So, like your insurance policy is going to cover you when someone falls down your stairs. Chris, can you tell us a little more about this critical type of insurance that everybody should carry?
It's called backups. You guys are all doing backups now. Now, I'll admit, Sean and I both work for a backup vendor, and no, we're not here to push Rubrik upon you. You should be thinking about your recovery strategy and not a backup strategy. And that's not necessarily words that you're going to hear from me from that. That's something that Paul Randall's been preaching for, God, I don't know how many years at this point. But he's been talking about that as well. Think about the things that you're trying to recover from. Someone does the mistake of running a change that they thought they were doing in development, or they thought they were doing in UAT, but they did it in production by accident. And that change just wiped out the contents of a table. It's a mistake. It's going to happen. DBAs constantly make those mistakes. It's going to happen. How do you recover from that? You have to go get the backup, and you have to start recovering that table. What do you do when it's a bigger issue? The database got dropped, or the database got some massive change to it that where the change went bad. How do you recover from the entire database that went bad? What do you do when the server goes down and you lost the server itself? How do you recover from that? And so it's thinking about the smallest thing and then start to branch out from there. Is trying to figure out how do you handle those recovery options. And yeah, you're going to go ahead and grab the backup. If it's a table, you're probably going to recover from that particular situation one way. If it's a whole entire database, you're going to recover from it in a slightly different way. If it's bigger, there's more steps involved all the way through. Think about the steps that are going to be required to do that recovery strategy, whether it be something as small or something very, very large. Document that process. Look at that process, and then see, when you start to do some backup testing, which, by the way, we're all testing our backups, because if no matter who you use for a backup vendor, whether it be us or you're using native backups, if you have not tested your backup, you don't have a backup. You've just wasted a bunch of cycles on your server to produce a file that you don't know is good. So make sure you're testing your backups. And a simple one and done test is not good enough. That test needs to be ongoing. Maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be done once a day, but you need to have some periodic tests against your backups to make sure that when you need those backups, you can use those backups for recovery. Occasionally, pull your backups from your offline storage. Is that from a tape? Is that from a third-party cloud provider's tier? Is that from some other vendor's giant archive storage utility? Like, pull a backup and go test it. You should have a documented plan for how to recover from different scenarios. Document it and test that process all the way through. One thing that needs to get also checked is bare metal recovery operations. Now, that may not necessarily fit into your environment. Think about it. If you have some physical servers in your environment and you're backing up that physical server, how do you recover from that physical server outage? There's lots of different bare metal recovery tools that are out there. You can, if you haven't tested it, which is a very difficult thing to test, I'll admit, how do you do that process? Because you don't want to have to get caught not knowing how to do it when you need to.
All right. So is a simple tabletop exercise enough here? I mean, because full-blown recovery testing's pretty big undertaking.
The tabletop exercises are really good to get you to think about things that you didn't normally think about when you were writing up your documentation and your plan. Actually testing it brings out a whole lot more that you didn't uncover through your tabletop exercise. So you're not going to do a full bare metal recovery operation every single week or every single day. That's not going to happen. I mean, the business is not going to let you do it. But then you're going to be able to test your backups for other things. I mean, if you're doing backups now and you're restoring them to UAT and to dev, you are testing your backup. You just proved your backup is restorable because you just did it for those types of operations. But are you testing the rest of the process for that recovery?
All right, thanks. Did you want to talk to this one, Chris, a little bit?
No, I'll let you go with it. I've been talking for a while.
You want to be able to get a quick drink?
Yes.
All right. So really, when we start talking about a lot of the options that we've discussed here, it's all boiling down to the concept of that zero trust data security, right? And that's where Rubrik for databases can come in. It's enabling you to really consolidate, all your database protection efforts into a single platform. We're going to let you get time back because we're going to automate that whole discovery and protection process. So let's get you on board, discovered, and backed up as quickly as possible with as little interaction as possible. And then, let's deliver really quick RTOs and keep you in control with options for recovery. And then ultimately, supports secondary users. So if you've got automated processes, say for self-service clones, things of that nature, let's make sure you've got the mechanisms in place to be able to support that. Now, with this type of simplification, easy for me to say, simplification and modernization of the backup process, it's really going to depend on automation. It's really going to be this that's important, or even more important than anything else you've got. But the big focus is going to be on recovery, right? We've talked about how restoring databases can be a real tedious task. Finding the files you need to recover and actually reassembling your fulls and incrementals and get a copy that's usable. So depending on your use case and the SLA, Rubrik's going to provide the DBA with a variety of options to recover, like export, instant recovery, recover production, file-only restores, and live mount. With any luck, we'll have some time toward the end of the session. We'll be able to talk more about live mounts. And just, imagine, if you will, with live mount, what you'll be able to do is resume operations for nearly almost instantaneously, or make hundreds of copies of a database without consuming all of the storage that typically goes along with it. So now we've covered a ton of material thus far. And we know steps we should take to prevent an attack and the resources we need to ensure we can recover from an attack. But now let's talk a little more about what we should be doing during an attack. Let's hope for all things holy that the Borg hasn't hacked your system. The fact of the matter is that breaches will happen. The key is going to be minimizing the impact of the breach, and that's going to be driven by how you respond to it. Chris, what should companies and their staff really do when they discover an attack?
The first thing is to take a breath. When a bad event happens to your data, everyone is going to be in a panic at that point. They're going to be thinking about the worst things that are potentially happening, and it's all going to be different levels of prioritization depending on what level the person is. Obviously, the CIO is going to have different levels of prioritization over your manager versus over you and other application groups. So take a step, breathe, and stay calm, because you being frazzled is not going to help the situation at all. You've already created your recovery plan. You've already created your run book. You know how to react to the bad event. So now it's all about looking at your run books, figuring out first, what's affected? You have to know that first, because if you know what's affected, then you know what runbook you can use to recover from whatever the bad event was. How big is the blast radius? You know it was one application, but how many other things were affected that touched that particular application? Your runbooks are going to help you understand what your recovery steps are. You're going to understand based on staying calm, understanding what the affected assets are, understanding what the blast radius is, reviewing your run books. You're going to start to understand what the plan of attack is to start doing the recovery. It's not just recover everything. You have to understand what's affected first. And staying calm and having that clear presence and clear mind will help you be more efficient and getting things up and running as fast as possible. Your run books are going to be crucial here. Those procedures that you've already gone through and you've documented and you've tested and you've run through in those tabletop exercises, now they're going into prime time and you need to use them. You should have because you've done some testing with your run books and your recovery plans, you'll have some ideas of what recovery times should be. So when you get that question from the 4 different managers, all in a panic, asking you, how fast can you get up and running? You can look at them with some confidence and say, it'll take us 2 hours to get up and running, or it'll take us 20 minutes to get up and running, because you've already done the testing and you know what the process should be. Start to think, depending on what the situation is, think about doing some recovery isolation, meaning the production database just had a bad outcome or a bad event that happened to it. Maybe recover a copy of that database from the last known good point in time to some other server, so you can look at it, understand it, figure out if that's the right backup that you need to use, figure out if it's got the right data that you need to use going forward. How far back do you have to go before you get to a good state with the least amount of data loss? What are your recovery tools? Do you have good, clean backups to come back from? Think about your operational tasks. Depending on the situation, you might want to stop operational tasks. Now, if it's obviously something small, that may not necessarily be the case, but if it's something much bigger, like a ransomware infection or something bigger like that, then you might want to stop any type of operational task to prevent it from spreading to other things. And if that's the case, maybe you don't back up that data so you don't spread the ransomware into your backups going further. And don't delete data. And the reason why you don't delete data is because if you're hit from a ransomware event, when you report that to the authorities, they want to look at that to understand what the problem was, how it got in, and they're going to do some investigation with them, as well as your auditors and your management. They're going to want to look at all that to understand what happened and prevent it from happening going forward. Your communication needs to be strong. And this is also where stopping, taking a breath, and staying calm is going to be very, very helpful, because when situations go bad, DBAs tend to get focused and start working on the problem only in what they know, but they have to still provide updates to management and to other teams to let them know what's going on. And a lot of times that gets tossed by the wayside because they're so hyper focused on fixing the problem, they forget about telling people what they know, so those other teams can start doing their recovery processes as well. The recovery options that are out there, that should actually be pretty known from your C-level down to your help desk. And I don't mean they all need to know the same level of detail, because depending on your position in the company, you're going to have a different level of detail than a next person should. But it should be communicated as to that, yeah, we can recover data back, to a specific way because of these tools that we have in place. And then everyone can now start to work with their users and work with other people to get those systems up and running and working.
All right. So, this really sounds to me a lot like how an elite athlete would train. You got to know what you need to do. You work with the tools you have and you practice until it becomes muscle memory. But what happens if somewhere in the process you're doing something wrong with how you're training?
It's not what if, you have to think that it's when. And because you can't think of every single thing that's going to happen to your environment. So you're going to think about as many things as possible, and you're going to plan for all those things. But when that bad event happens and you go through your run books, you go through your process and you get things up and running, you should be documenting the process all the way through of what's going on, because afterwards the post-mortem is actually very, very important. Understand what happened. Talk about it. Talk about what exactly happened. Think about it, and this is going to be something that you really want to ask the next question, which is, what proactive steps failed? It's not because you didn't do a good job and you failed. You had an idea, you thought that something was a risk, and you put a process in place, but something sidestepped that. Something was different than what your thought was. Okay, great. Now you have to adapt to that and figure out another way to prevent going forward. Maybe it wasn't anything that you could have done to prevent that process from failing. Maybe you did all the right things. You used the least privilege required for that application. You're fully patched. You're working with all the teams. You're doing all the right things. But maybe something else happened. Maybe it was something outside of your control, like a vendor process failed, and that's what caused the outage. Okay, how do you fix that going forward? You're going to spend a ton of money on a ton of different tools to monitor your environment, to take care of your environment, to manage the environment. You're going to put all these proactive tools in. Which ones failed, and why did they fail? Because you'll need to make some tweaks and adjustments to those tools and to those configurations to ensure that they don't fail again for the next time. What systems and procedures failed? Again, same type of thing. It's nothing on you. It's not a personal thing. It's all thinking about what are those things that have failed, so then you can fix those things from happening again. But just as important as all the things I just laid out that failed and what went wrong in those processes, what went right? That's really important as well, because as equal as something that failed, and you put these processes in place that okay, something went wrong there, but these 10 other things that you did over here all work the way that they're supposed to, and they prevented a bigger problem from happening. That needs to be called out as well, because maybe there's some learnings from there that you can use. What are the variants that you had no idea could have even happened? Let's be honest, we don't know everything as much as we like. There's going to be things that are going to happen that we have no control over, we have no knowledge of. It's all the things we don't know. So once they've happened, we now know about them. How do we deal with them going forward? You've spent a ton of money on tools and procedures, run books, testing. What's the ROI on the plan that you put together versus what happened? If you didn't have that plan in place, would the situation have been worse or better versus what you did and to mitigate all those the issues that came up? Did the plan that you put in place, did it net the benefits that you expected it to happen? And if it did, that's great. Let's improve upon that. Constantly keep improving upon that. And thinking about what should be changed. Is there an order that should be changed? Is it Is it process that should be changed? Is a new tool required to help you? Maybe to augment what you already have or to replace something that you already have? Do you need different technology? You know, do you have the right technology to give you high availability or failover into different areas? If you're only in one data center and you don't have a secondary data center to fail over to, is that right? Maybe that's what sparks the business to say, okay, let's put our stuff into one of the cloud providers or into another data center or into a different colo, so you have that redundancy someplace else. It's all questions that need to be asked, and the business starts to look at this and they can make informed decisions based on your postmortem.
So I just want to verify one thing with you. The whole concept of the postmortem isn't for me as a manager to be pointing out that Chris, my DBA, completely messed everything up.
No, it's not about associating blame to a person. It's just all about figuring out what the process that you have in place and all the things that just happened was it right, or do you have to make adjustments? Just like as you mentioned, the elite athlete, you know, when they're not doing what they need to do to win, they start looking at game film and things that they've done in their performances to get better. And you only can get better based on the data that you have and reviewing it and working with it and learning from it.
All right. So we've covered a bunch of stuff. Let's recap some of the key takeaways that I picked up out of this. Probably the biggest things are, one, you know, we've got to work with the organization's security team in an effort to prevent a breach. Then it's really not realistic to think we can stop every attack vector. There's just too many of them out there. So we need to make sure that we're protecting our critical assets and have a mechanism to return them to service quickly in the event of competence. Lastly, panic under stress is going to be our worst enemy. Having the plan isn't enough. We need to make sure we're executing the plan regularly and that we revise it when we discover shortcomings. You know, that comprehensive response plan really ensures that all the participants know their role and what they need to do. Testing this plan in a controlled fashion really enables everyone to understand what's expected of them. So with that, you know, I know you've seen a high level of some of the unique features that Rubrik has for database protection that I presented earlier, but you know, most of us are DBAs here, not necessarily salespeople. So one thing I want to highlight with you is, as we start looking at items that are out there for public domain, I want to point out that Rubrik has really had the most complete vision for the third year in a row in Gartner's Magic Quadrant. This came out a couple weeks ago. So we're really paving the way for data security. So I think if you start poking around and you look at what we have to offer, you're going to like what you see. When we get done with the session, and if you're interested in going into a little more detail about the offerings that we have, I really recommend that you keep an eye out for some of the virtual events that we offer, where you can actually get your hands on the product and can see it in action for yourself. You know, there's also some additional material that we've got at the bottom here that give you an idea of what to look for in modern data protection solutions and databases, as well as a link to a guide on how to recover from ransomware if you're interested. And with that, Chris and I really want to thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask away.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the folks that are still on? I think we're good. Well, hey, thanks to both of you. That was fantastic. I really do appreciate your time. If you're listening to this after the fact on our YouTube channel, please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any additional questions, and we're happy to answer them. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you all at the next one.
Appreciate the time.
Thank you.